Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Elizabeth Rigo, and I am your host for tonight's MassSupport Town Hall, Shelter from the Storm. Because housing insecurity continues to increase during this pandemic, we would like to share some helpful information and resources relative to housing assistance. Really excited tonight to have some really interesting and informative panelists with us. We have David Yurdenia, an Assistant Attorney General. And we also have Yarlenis Villemin, an Outreach Director, Community Engagement Division, Office of the Attorney General. We'll also be hearing from Amy Mullen from Raft and Irma Program Overview, and our very own Colby Andrade from MassSupport. Let me tell you a little bit about MassSupport. MassSupport is a crisis counseling program, and it provides free, anonymous, confidential support, counseling resources, referrals to people of all ages in Massachusetts. We are also doing group services, consulting for organizations and businesses. We are educating on traumatic stress, resilience building, coping strategies, and more. We are made up of diverse teams statewide with approximately 54 counselors and clinicians that speak multiple languages. MassSupport is funded by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and managed in partnership with the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health and Riverside Trauma Center, a service of Riverside Community Care. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. Yarlenis Villemin is an outreach director within Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey's community engagement team. Yarlenis has worked on issues and educational campaigns ranging from workers' rights, landlord and tenant rights, immigrants' rights, and everything in between. Yarlenis holds a master's in public administration from Suffolk University in Boston, Mass, and a Bachelor of Arts from College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. David Yurdenia is an Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's Office. Before he joined the Civil Rights Division, David worked with immigrant worker communities in New York City as an employment lawyer. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the brief introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you again, MassSupport, for organizing this amazing event and for inviting our colleagues from the Attorney General's Office to present on today's important topics on landlord and tenant rights. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Yarlenis Villemin, and I'm an outreach director in the Community Engagement Division. It is a pleasure to be here today. And I'm also here with my colleague, David Yurdenia, who's the Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division. Before I give the platform to my colleague, David Yurdenia, I'm just gonna give you all a little overview of our office and what we do, where we're located, and how we can continue to serve each and every one of you. On the next slide, I'm just going to give you a little overview about who the Attorney General is. The Attorney General, her name is Maura Healey, and she's the Chief Lawyer and Law Enforcement Officer of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I will give you a couple examples on the next coming slides, how we enforce the law in the state of Massachusetts, and also how we can serve you. But on the next slide, I want to give you just a little information about where we're located throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So one important, on your screen, you're going to be seeing a map. If you double click again, you will see in the Boston, we have our main headquarters in Boston, where we have 2 offices, one in One Ashburton Place and the other one at 100 Cambridge Street. But we're also located in New Bedford in the southern part of Massachusetts, as well as the central part of Massachusetts as Worcester, and the western part of Massachusetts as Springfield. We want to make sure for those of you who have joined us today from different parts of the area, just know that any of the locations that we are located, you can go. Unfortunately, and this is where the next slide will explain, due to the pandemic and health crisis we're undergoing because of COVID-19, our office is currently entirely virtually, but we still remain committed to serving members of the Commonwealth, and all our hotlines are fully staffed during our regular hours. Walk-ins are encouraged to file complaints online or to call our office. And I'm gonna give you all the hotlines information that you should know at the end of today's presentation, where you can have a direct phone number where you can call us. We are open Monday to Friday from 9 to 5 p.m. But just know as well that if you have clients that speak another language, we have the service and the capacity to serve anybody in the state of Massachusetts in whatever language they feel comfortable. We want to make sure that we still maintain to be a transparent state agency serving everybody around the state of Massachusetts. So one important information is the who and how we serve. The who, we serve every single resident of the Commonwealth and their public interests. But one important information, especially when we talk about the word resident, it is, I don't want to say it's somebody with a green card or legal status. It's anybody that lives in this Commonwealth, no matter their legal status. If you are an undocumented immigrant living in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we still serve you as long as you live in this Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We also serve state departments, officers, and commission, as well as group of consumers. And I'm gonna give you a few examples. We are all group of consumers. We love shopping. We have businesses. So one important information, especially throughout the holidays right now, many of you are shopping online. And let's say, for example, that you buy the newest electronic device right now, but the store you purchased that device gave you a deceptive product that does not work, and you have issue getting a return policy or hearing back from that particular store that you potentially bought online. If you have issues like that as a consumer, we can help you and assist you. If you need help with any healthcare questions, we can help you as well. Or if you are a worker and you have clients who are workers right now to have questions about the earned sick time or the minimum wage, or their employer hasn't paid them what they're supposed to, please urge them that they can call our office and we can help them as well. There are other consumer related issues that we can help, and all our services are completely free. Now, there are 4 major ways that we work in our office. One of them is investigation. We do a lot of investigating work in our office, especially as it relates to workers' violation in the state. We do the enforcement part as well, especially as the minimum wage is changing. And next year, every worker who are being paid the minimum wage are supposed to be paid $13.75. So one important information, we want to make sure that the laws are enforced here in the Commonwealth, that also the policy, we work with every elected official throughout the Commonwealth. We advocate on different type of legislation. We don't write the law, those are your elected officials. But we also do the prevention part in our office, and this is where we are today. Our office, our division was created by the Attorney General herself during her first term to make sure everybody in this Commonwealth knew about the resources and services that we can offer, and also know that you have rights. And this is the best way we can educate you, especially on today's topic related to housing. On the next slide, I'm going to give the platform to my colleague, David Ureña, who works under the Department of the Public Protection and Advocacy Bureau in our office.
Just 1 second as I work through a technical issue on my end. Great. Hello, everyone. My name is David Ureña. I'm an Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division at the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. So I want to talk with you tonight about some basic landlord and tenant rights and obligations that would be helpful to know at this time. And I'll briefly cover some information pertaining to the current eviction crisis and resources that are available for landlords and tenants. And I guess if we could just move on to the next slide. I think at the bottom you'll see that the Public Protection and Advocacy Bureau houses different divisions, including the Civil Rights Division, along with others that help workers, that help consumers, and that help basically insurance policyholders and other consumers of financial services products in the Commonwealth. On the next slide, we'll see, and the slide after this one, we'll see that there are some basics as far as the obligations for landlords and tenants. And this is the baseline that exists for every landlord and tenant relationship in the Commonwealth. So on the tenant side, this is something that most of us know. The tenant has to pay their rent and follow the rules that they agree to when they first enter that relationship with the landlord. And the tenant also has to accept responsibility for damages that we describe as beyond normal wear and tear. And what this means is everyone knows that using a rental unit means that there is going to be some wear and tear to the unit. So, you know, the floors might get scuffed up, things like that. But sometimes things happen and something might get broken that doesn't usually get broken. So for example, if for some reason there's an accident and there is tiling in the kitchen that is cracked due to a heavy object falling onto the tiling, that might be something that at the end of the tenancy or the lease, the tenant may be responsible for covering. And typically that's done through the security deposit, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. Now on the landlord side, the basic requirements, and I'm not saying that these are the only requirements, but a couple of the more basic requirements include providing the tenant with an apartment that's safe and clean and that meets the requirements that are set out under the Commonwealth's sanitary code. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. Also, the landlord has to fulfill the promises that they make to the tenant in the lease or whatever agreement that they make with the tenant at the outset. So next, let's talk about some of the things that one should know as a landlord and as a tenant at the outset. So when it comes time for a tenant to begin their tenancy, there are certain things that landlords can require the tenant to pay at the very beginning. So a couple of the more common things, so first and last month's rent. And the last month's rent can't be a larger amount than the first month's rent, so they have to be equal. And then a security deposit is fairly common, and that amount also has to be no more than the first month's rent. And if the landlord ends up charging the tenant a security deposit and the last month's rent, then they are supposed to provide the tenant with a receipt for those payments and some statement showing that they charged the tenant those amounts. The last thing that a landlord can charge a tenant is for the cost of basically replacing the locks and keys in order to install a new set of locks. on their apartment door. So those are really the four things that landlords can charge at the very beginning. And outside of those four things, it's very unlikely that the Commonwealth's laws and rules permit a landlord to charge anything more. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So there are a lot of rules that apply to security deposits. And this is something that we usually find is not very commonly known, but basically when a landlord charges a security deposit, this is money that's meant to cover things that might end up happening, not necessarily through the tenant's own fault, but maybe because an accident happens. So if there's some damage to the rental unit that isn't just like scuffs or things that happen to the paint, etc. So this is what the security deposit usually is for. And if the landlord charges a security deposit, then they have to give the tenant certain information. So they have to give the tenant, first they have to deposit that money in a bank account that accrues interest. And they have to provide the tenant with the information for the bank account, including the name and address of the bank that holds the account, and the account number where that tenant's security deposit is going to be held for the time that they're a tenant. Now, as the security deposit is held, it's going to start to accumulate interest, and each year the landlord is supposed to either pay the tenant whatever interest built up for that year, or let the tenant deduct that amount from their next rent payment. And because security deposits or interest rates actually are really low, then this is usually not a very big amount of money, but it's still the rule that the landlord is supposed to either give this interest money to the tenant, or let them deduct that amount from the next month's rent. Now, at the beginning, how do you, let's say at the very end, the tenant is moving out, and there might be some things that are wrong with the apartment. How does the tenant and landlord know that those things weren't already broken or damaged at the very beginning? Well, technically the landlord is supposed to provide a tenant at the very beginning of the tenancy something that's called a statement of condition, and this document is supposed to describe the condition of the apartment and also describe any damage that exists in the apartment at the time that the tenant is moving in. But a lot of times this doesn't happen. But as a tenant, you don't need to necessarily wait to have the landlord give you the statement. You can actually prepare one on your own. And you can document the things that you see in the apartment that aren't that might be damaged or need to be fixed. And you do this at the very beginning when you move in, and put this in writing and give a copy to the landlord so that you have some proof that you notify the landlord at the very beginning of certain issues that exist in the apartment. Now, the final thing to know about security deposits is that when the tenancy ends, when the tenant is going to be moving out, the landlord has to return that security deposit and whatever interest may be added to that within 30 days of the tenancy ending. So if the person's lease is for a year, the end of June through to the, or let's say the first day of July through to the end of June the following year, when that person moves out the end of June the following year, the landlord has 30 days after that point, so the end of July, in order to return that security deposit. And if they don't, then there could be a potential issue there that the tenant might be able to do something about. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So Massachusetts, there's a law that sets minimum requirements for rental units that landlords have to comply with. And this basically is what requires landlords to provide a decent place of living to tenants. Now, the things that landlords have to do to comply with the sanitary code can be it could be a very long list. But you know, for example, I think the basics would include for apartments having heat, hot water, electricity. You have to have kitchens and bathrooms with sinks in them and running water, and the doors and windows to the apartment they have to have locks. But there is a very long list of other requirements that landlords must meet. And I would encourage those of you who are watching this to seek out some additional information about what may be required of landlords by going to a couple of resources that we can, I think, maybe discuss or even distribute either at the end of this or afterwards. You know, the basics are that the sanitary code, it requires that the unit be habitable. That's another way of saying that the unit has to be comfortable and clean enough for someone to live there safely. And if it turns out that there's a violation of the sanitary code, like for example, the doors and windows don't have locks, and the tenant complains about this to the landlord maybe doesn't address the issue. At that point, the tenant can request their town or city's inspectional services department or Department of Health to send an inspector out and do an inspection of the rental unit to determine whether there are any sanitary code violations or not. If there are, then that inspector will issue a notice to the landlord that lists what the violations are and gives the landlord a certain amount of time to fix the violations. And depending on the seriousness of the issue, the landlord might have as little as 24 hours to fix the violation, or even up to 30 days to fix certain violations. It just depends on the seriousness of the violation. If the landlord fails to fix the issue within the amount of time that they have, then it's possible that the Inspectional Services Department or Department of Health could try to issue penalties against the landlord or even bring an enforcement case against the landlord. It's also possible that the tenant could be able to withhold some rent to account for the violations that exist in the apartment. Because if there are sanitary code violations, then arguably the unit is not necessarily worth the rate that the landlord is charging the tenant at the very beginning, which is like the market rate. One thing that everyone should be careful about, though, if this is a situation you find yourself in, is to make sure to go over this with an attorney if you can before withholding rent, because if you fail to make your full rent payments, this could be a violation of your lease, and a landlord could technically start eviction proceedings because of the lease violation. We can move on to the next slide. So there was a eviction moratorium in place in Massachusetts, but that expired on October 17th. And currently there is a federal eviction moratorium in place that covers certain tenants who are impacted by COVID-19. And that is in place through at least December 31st, 2020. It's possible that the CDC could extend this. It's possible that it will expire on December 31st. But part of the requirement for a tenant to be protected under this moratorium is that they have to provide a declaration to their landlord. And this is a form that you can find online along with other information about the different requirements that you have to meet in order to be eligible to be covered by this moratorium. But the thing to keep in mind is that this moratorium is really meant for people who have been financially affected by COVID-19, either because they were laid off, lost employment, they had hours cut, or they have had to pay significant medical expenses in connection with the pandemic, things of that nature. So if those kinds of losses don't apply in someone's situation, then it's in the tenant's best interest to continue to keep paying rent if they're able to do so. So this is just, the next slide is another slide reinforcing this, information that the moratorium, even the Massachusetts moratorium that expired, but under the CDC moratorium, this doesn't mean that a tenant is not obligated to pay their rent. The rent obligation continues. It's just that if the tenant is unable to pay their rent because of these reasons, the landlord is not able to evict them physically until after the moratorium is over, assuming that they have a court order giving them permission to do so. Just because a tenant can't pay rent and can't get evicted doesn't mean a landlord can't try to do things to recover the rent owed. Landlords can still bring cases in civil court to try to get money from the tenant, and that's different from eviction cases, but we won't be really getting into that tonight. But I think if you find yourself in a situation where you've been impacted financially by COVID-19, you should be sure to notify your landlord within 30 days of missing your rent payment, and you should seek out help to access resources that might be available to you to help you either pay rent or to help you avoid eviction if you're unable to pay rent, and the other resources available to you are not sufficient. We're trying to encourage landlords and tenants to try to work out payment plans that will allow tenants to remain housed, and that will also get landlords the rent that they are due under their leases with tenants. Next slide. This will be covered in more detail later on, so I don't want to spend much time on this, but you might have heard that the governor has put up a eviction diversion initiative and funded it with $100 million to help families throughout the Commonwealth with rental assistance to help them pay rent that they might owe or can't afford to pay moving forward. And this has made money available to households from $4,000 up to $10,000, depending on the household circumstances, and is something that is really crucial and might be available to you if you find yourself in a situation where you are owing rent or you have concerns about being able to continue affording your rent because of a financial issue caused by COVID. The funding is administered through what's called housing consumer education centers. So there's an education center in each region throughout the Commonwealth, but I think that might get covered later on. So I think we can move on to the next slide. And I'll try to move quickly now because I know that we don't want to run over time. So retaliation. The law prohibits landlords from taking some sort of negative action against their tenant in response to their tenant trying to assert their rights about something. So for example, if a tenant has lost their heat or hot water during the winter and the landlord isn't doing anything to fix the issue, and the tenant decides that they're going to call their inspectional services department to get an inspector out and hopefully get them to require their landlord to do the fix. If the landlord doesn't like that and decides that they want the tenant out because they don't want to be forced to do something they don't want to do, and then they bring an eviction case, that would be considered retaliation, which is unlawful under the Commonwealth's laws and rules. So you can't be evicted for exercising your rights. There are various rights that you have as a tenant. And I guess the bottom line is, if you feel like your landlord is doing something in response to you exercising a right, you should try to speak with someone in case that is retaliation, and in case that's something that the law prohibits. Next slide. So eviction can be very scary. The bottom line and the takeaway here that I hope you all get is that it is really a multi-step process that doesn't happen overnight or even over the course of 1 week. There are various requirements that have to be met, and until the landlord gets a court order from a judge that gives them permission to evict someone from their rental unit, the landlord is not allowed to do anything to kick that person out. So the process begins with a landlord giving the tenant something that's commonly referred to as a notice to quit. This is basically just a letter that's telling the tenant that the landlord wants them out by a certain date due to certain either violations of the lease, or maybe the lease is up and the landlord doesn't want to renew it. Once the tenant receives that, if the tenant doesn't leave by the date that the landlord puts in that notice to quit, then at that point, that doesn't mean that the landlord gets to kick you out. That only means that the landlord can now go to court and bring the case to get the court's permission to kick you out. So the landlord ends up filing a complaint in the court and gets a summons and serves as summons on the tenant. And that basically gives the tenant notice that there's been a case filed against them in housing court or maybe in district court. So at that point, once a complaint has been filed and served along with the summons on the tenant has a certain period of time to respond to that complaint in writing. And in that answer, they are basically providing the reasons why they believe they shouldn't be evicted. There might be many reasons why they believe they shouldn't be evicted, and some of the more important reasons could include things like there are very bad conditions in the apartment, or maybe the landlord started the eviction case because they're retaliating against them for exercising their rights. So that's the opportunity the tenant has to try to persuade the court that they do not, that they can continue living in the apartment. If the tenant doesn't end up submitting the answer within the time that they have to do so, they can still try to bring the answer with them to court, and the court might still accept it even if they hadn't provided it earlier. But once the court date comes and the tenant will get a notification of when that is, then at that point it becomes a matter of the landlord and the tenant explaining to the judge why the tenant shouldn't be evicted, or why the landlord should be allowed to evict the tenant. And the judge will decide whether the landlord can or cannot evict the tenant, and give some sort of time period for the tenant to continue being in the rental unit until the landlord can technically get someone to physically remove the tenant. But overall, you should just know that as a tenant, you may have defenses to the eviction that are important and that you can raise in your answer or raise during court. And as a landlord, you have to follow these legal requirements and these steps. You can't just kick somebody out without going through the legal process that's required. Next slide. So our office has a eviction help request form available online that you can access and fill out if you're facing a situation where you're being evicted. Either your landlord has brought a case against you, or your landlord is trying to evict you without going through court. And that's the link that you can go to access that form and fill that out. So I think that might get distributed to you all later on as either part of the presentation or through some other means. Next slide. So something that is usually what I work on as an attorney in the Civil Rights Division is housing discrimination. And unfortunately, it's very common and it can take many, many forms. So we don't have time to discuss tonight what kinds of forms it can take, but it can happen at any point in the housing search process, or even after a tenant has started to live in an apartment. So for example, when you apply for an apartment, something might happen in that application process that could be considered discrimination under the law. Or after you move into the apartment, something that can happen afterward that could be considered discrimination under the law. But it's important to know that it's illegal in Massachusetts to discriminate against someone because of in housing, because of their race, color, national origin, ancestry, gender, marital status, religion, age, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, military background, or disability. And as I mentioned, discrimination can take many forms. It can be against one particular tenant in a household of a few tenants. It could be against the household itself. But the bottom line is that it's unlawful to do something, take some sort of adverse action or a negative action against someone applying for an apartment or one of your tenants based on any of these listed reasons. So one reason that's not listed here is source of income. So it's important to know that in Massachusetts, if you are, for example, a Section 8 voucher holder, or if you apply for and receive something like Raft in order to help you with moving expenses or to find a new apartment or even to pay rent arrears, that it is unlawful for landlords and even real estate agents to discriminate against you based on those characteristics. And that's also something that the office will be addressing soon by releasing an advisory that I think will circulate to Riverside and our MassSupport, and there's also a booklet that we have available on the Attorney General's website that addresses source of income discrimination specifically that we can also provide. Next slide. So just a couple left and then I can finish up. So housing scams, it's something that is very common, unfortunately. Usually this takes the form of, someone searching for an apartment, sight unseen. They apply for it, they think they get an apartment, they go in person to go move in, and all of a sudden, someone's already living there. It turns out the apartment doesn't exist, something along those lines. So it's important to know that, it's easy to fake listings online. And if you can, it's better to use a licensed real estate broker or a salesperson to find an apartment. There's a resource that you can use to verify someone's license online. But if that's, regardless of whether or not you do that, use a broker, agent, or salesperson. Some things to keep an eye out for are when you look at apartment ads, whether the ad is poorly written. If something seems like too good to be true, like a very cheap rent for the amount of space you get, or so close to convenient like MBTA stations, things like that, for the amount of rent being charged, then it might be in fact too good to be true. Or maybe if the ad itself, or after you contact the person who posted the ad, they request payment from you using methods that are untraceable, like wire transfers, for example, then you should be on alert that that might be a scam. Also, never under any circumstances give somebody your social security number or PayPal account information to someone that you only met online. And if you are a victim of an online apartment scam, there is a website you can go to file a complaint with the FBI. That's here at the bottom of the slide. It's IC looks like ic3.gov. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the Attorney General's office has some resources available for different areas based on the current pandemic. So our general resource page is listed here, and then there's a guide to landlord and tenant rights on the website as well. Next slide. In order to file a complaint with us about an unfair, deceptive business practice, you can always call us at this phone number. That's our consumer hotline, or file an online complaint form. And this is separate from that help request form that I mentioned earlier. And then on this final slide, these are all the hotlines that might be relevant to you and are very issue specific. So there's a consumer hotline, Civil Rights Division has its own hotline. So if you think you've been discriminated against, you can call us there to file a complaint. And there's also other hotlines listed below. I think I'll try to finish up so I don't take up too much more time. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I believe that's the last part of our slides. Just a few questions, David, some people had was, can a documented person apply for Raft? And that is yes, they can apply for Raft. There are no immigration restriction. And I know somebody from DHCD, which is the Department of Housing and Development, will be talking next a little more about Raft. So this will be a great transition. And a last question somebody asked David was, what can happen if the tenant has a cosigner? Could the landlord kick the tenant out if the cosigner refuses to pay?
Okay, so as to that last question about cosigners, I think that really gets to whether or not there's rent owed, because if there is rent owed, then the cosigner is on the hook for that rent. So if that rent isn't paid, then yes, the landlord can resort to eviction and get that tenant out of the apartment. And as a cosigner, that person can be on the hook for any rent that's owed. So the landlord, if they decide to go after the tenant and the cosigner for the money, and this is apart from the eviction, they can file a lawsuit in civil court to try to get a judgment against the cosigner and the tenant, and to try to collect on that judgment later on.
Thank you so much, David. And I know at the end of today's presentation, there will be a Q&A section as well. There was somebody that asked that they were looking to have more information for homeowners who have a hard time paying mortgage. One important information for the person who asked that question is that on our mass.gov COVID-19 research page that David mentioned, you can have a section there that has some resources, especially for homeowners as well. So thank you, everyone, and I'll leave the platform to the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Yarlenis and David, for that very pertinent information. Next, we are going to hear from Amy Mullen. Amy Mullen is the Program Director for the Raft and Home-Based Programs at the Department of Housing and Community Development. She joined DHCD in 2016 after previously working at 2 other local housing nonprofits, Metro Housing Boston and Heading Home. Amy earned her Master of Public Administration degree from UMass Boston in 2019. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to MassSupport for hosting this town hall to make sure this important information gets out to everyone who needs it throughout the Commonwealth. Thanks to everyone who's listening today for joining us. I'm going to talk about 2 emergency rent and mortgage assistance programs, Raft and IRMA. IRMA is a new program, whereas Raft is an existing program that's been expanded during COVID. And like David mentioned earlier, both programs are part of the Baker-Polito administration's Eviction, Diversion initiative. So tonight I'm going to talk about eligibility for both of these programs and how tenants, homeowners, and homeless households can access them. So Raft is a program that's been around for a while. Many people may already be familiar with it, but if you're not, it's a program that pays up to $4,000 in assistance to prevent homelessness. It, as of recently, as of about 2 months ago, we can also pay up to $10,000 to prevent eviction for renters who've experienced a financial hardship related to COVID-19. But that's not the only group of people who can access Raft. It's still open to everyone who qualifies. And Raft serves households with income up to 50% of the area median income, or the AMI. And it actually goes up to 60% AMI for households at risk of homelessness because of domestic violence. IRMA is a new program that launched on July 1st in response to COVID. And it is similar to Raft in a lot of ways. The big difference is that it helps people with slightly higher income than Raft. So Raft goes up to 50% AMI. IRMA can actually serve households with income between 50 and 80% AMI. So it goes up quite a bit higher to try to reach folks with a little bit higher income who still need some assistance. And that's for renters or homeowners, as is Raft. So I know there was a question earlier about, is there assistance for people who are behind on mortgage? And Raft and IRMA can help in both of those situations if the homeowner has low to moderate income under these limits. Applications for assistance go through the regional administering agencies, or the RAAs, which are 11 nonprofits throughout the state who contract with DHCD to administer the programs in their regions. And I'll just note, I'm not going to get into these, but many RAAs administer other local or private funds as well. So after COVID, we saw some federal assistance come to states and municipalities, and a lot of cities and towns created their own rental assistance programs. So the RAAs administer some of those and know about a lot of them throughout the state. So if you are working with someone who needs more assistance than what Raft or IRMA can provide, there may be additional funds that they can tap into. So these are the 11 RAAs that offer Raft. They each have their own region. So they're the 9 housing consumer education centers that I believe David mentioned earlier, the HCECs. And then there's 2 additional nonprofits who don't have HCECs, but who do have Raft funds. And that's the Lynn Housing Authority and Neighborhood Development and the Central Mass Housing Alliance in Worcester. So of course, many RAAs are operating remotely during the pandemic. DHCD, our office is fully remote, but the RAAs, some or most have some level of in-person services that they're offering, or they may have some staff who are in the office who can collect, mail and faxes. But at this point, most of the interaction with constituents seeking assistance and applying for Raft and IRMA is being done remotely. So related to that, each RAA's website is really the best source right now of information about how to do a Raft application, or get in touch with someone, a housing counselor or a case manager, to talk about their situation. As they, close down or reopen, they put that information up on their websites, but really the websites are kind of the best place to go right now. DHCD does provide a lookup tool at this link. And if you go to mass.gov/COVID housing help, there's a lot of information about both programs that includes a link to that lookup tool. So if you search for, there's a drop down and you can look for any of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. You click the one that the constituent lives in, and that brings you to information about which RAA is the right one to contact, along with their website and their phone number and their address. So for Raft and IRMA, applicants need to apply at the RAA that covers the city or town that they're living in, if they're applying for help to stay, or if they're going to use the program to move, because Raft can be used for moving assistance as well. They should apply at the RAA that covers the city or town that they're moving to. So Raft, again, up to $4,000. It goes up to $10,000 for households facing eviction who've experienced a financial hardship related to COVID. So we just heard about the different steps that a landlord has to take to actually evict a tenant. And folks can apply for the $10,000 benefit or the $4,000 benefit before the landlord's actually started that court eviction. Those of you who are familiar with Raft from a few years ago may remember it. For a while, it was a requirement. Raft could only serve households who were already at that late stage where they were, involved in a court eviction and really, really imminently close to becoming homeless. With this funding, we're able to help people both at that court stage, but also before. So a household who's maybe fallen behind 1 month and the landlord hasn't taken action yet, but could. Or even for COVID, people who have lost their jobs and know that they're going to fall behind, but haven't yet, they can still apply at that stage. It's really intended to be a flexible benefit that can meet each household's unique needs. So it can help with a lot of different things. It also serves households of all sizes and configurations who are at risk of homelessness. So it used to be a requirement that folks needed to have a dependent child under 21 or be pregnant to qualify because the funds were targeted to families with children, but that's no longer the case. And I just highlight that because we do get some questions sometimes from people who think that that's still a requirement. And so we're trying to get the word out that it's not. Any type of household, single person, an elderly couple, someone with adult children, everyone can qualify and be found eligible if they're at risk of homelessness and they meet the income eligibility criteria. So down here are a few, if you can just go back to the previous slide, just a few different things that we can pay for. So it's most people use it to pay rent arrears, so back rent that they weren't able to pay that the landlord is now collecting on. But we can also use it to help people with ongoing rent in the form of rent stipends, moving costs, again, mortgage assistance for homeowners, utility payments, startup costs like a security deposit or first and last month's rent and furniture, and more. It's really intended to be a flexible response to whatever housing emergency the person's facing. So these are the list of eligible housing crises that the standard Raft program can help with, and I'll talk about some of the COVID changes in a moment. But eviction is really the big one, and that's kind of, again, court and before court. I would say in a normal year, about half of the funds go to people who are trying to get help to stay in their rental unit. We don't have, a ton of data yet on the payments in COVID, but I think it's actually even higher than that. There's a lot of people at risk of eviction trying to use the funds to stay where they are and not become homeless and not have to move. That being said, we also help folks who, aren't renting, but maybe they're living with a family member or staying on someone's couch. That's what we call doubled up and asked to leave. We can help people with moving costs to kind of get out of that situation and get into their own housing. We can help if people are at risk really due to any kind of health or safety crisis, as well as foreclosure for homeowners, overcrowding, domestic violence, fire and flood, natural disaster, a utility shutoff, and really any other crisis that's going to result in the person losing housing imminently. And again, it pays for expenses related to resolving that, whatever housing crisis they've presented to the RAA with. Go to the next slide. So again, after COVID, or in response to the onset of COVID, the Baker-Polito administration announced additional funding to Raft for households who are kind of eligible for Raft, that same group of people that would have normally gotten Raft, but people who are in that situation because of COVID. And so that could mean a lot of different things. I think the most common is, someone whose workplace was shut down, maybe a restaurant worker suddenly lost hours and was no longer able to pay the rent. but it could also be, and we've had applications from people who, you know, with their kids at home all the time now doing remote schooling, their grocery bill has gone up and their money's going to groceries instead of rent. Or, you know, they had to buy new Chromebooks because the kids' schools didn't offer them for remote learning. There's a lot of different ways that COVID has impacted people financially. And so this funding is intended to help those people with their housing costs during COVID. We've also been able to introduce some new flexible policies to make the Raft application process a little simpler. And these apply to all types of Raft, not just the funds that are set aside for COVID situations. So we were able to relax some of the requirements for documentation. Households no longer need to show their social security cards or their kids' birth certificates. We can take just an ID from the head of household. We've kind of gone virtual. Applications are online and folks can e-sign them instead of having to sign with a pen, although they can still, you know, they can do either or. Again, a court summons is no longer required to help people with rent arrears. And if someone's applying because of COVID, we can help them before they fall behind, kind of in advance with future rent. And we have come out with a new shorter application, and we actually just made it a little bit shorter than that in October to really make it, you know, the RAAs are getting a lot of applications, and we want to help people apply faster and complete their application more thoroughly the first time, and make it easier for the RAAs to review them. So there, I mean, there is a lot of, there's a lot of applications kind of in process right now. I saw some questions in the chat about kind of wait times and how long it takes to hear back. We're asking people to be as patient as they can right now while working really closely with the RAAs to try to speed up processing and get the funds out to households who need them as soon as we can. I'll also just mention on the Social Security card, there's a question earlier about, you know, immigration status. There's no immigration requirement for Raft or immigration status requirement. So undocumented households can apply and they don't need to have a Social Security card. Our application asks for a social if someone has one, but if they don't have one because they've never been assigned one, they can just leave it blank or say, you know, not applicable, and there's no, that doesn't impact their eligibility at all. Next slide, please. Great. And so as of October 19th, just about 2 months ago, we introduced the higher benefit above $4,000. So tenants at risk of eviction are now able to access between $4,001 and $10,000 if they meet these 3 criteria. So one, their financial hardship is related to COVID in some way. 2, the payment above $4,000 will keep them stably housed for at least 6 months, or until the end of June for households with school-aged children, whichever's later. But now that we're coming up on January, those 2 things are, you know, effectively the same. But we're looking, if we pay off this higher benefit, it's got to pay off in that it keeps the household there for at least 6 months. And the tenant is required to pay at least 30% of whatever their income is at the time of the application toward their future rent. And Raft can kind of help with that if the rent's not affordable on their current income. That's just for people in market rent housing. People in subsidized housing, of course, their subsidy will help pay with the rent or pay for the rent. So we would just pay for arrears for someone with a subsidy because they, you know, wouldn't need a stipend payment. And then some households are referred to Raft by the courts or by community mediation programs, in which case the mediator might work on that agreement between the tenant and the landlord. But if someone isn't working with a mediator, the RAA can either negotiate an agreement with the tenant or landlord, or they actually have the ability to refer out to the community mediation centers if, you know, it's a tough relationship with the tenant and landlord, or, you know, they owe so much money that there's going to have to be a pretty substantial agreement. They might refer that out to someone with, you know, a little more formal mediation experience. But some of those agreements are being handled in-house with the RAA as well. So really every RAA has a sort of, it's sort of its own application process. They all use the same application, but again, some are online. Some use slightly different application tools for the online application. So really the best way to find the application is to go to their websites. So the application timeline, it varies. It could be, 2 weeks at some of the smaller RAAs to 6 or more weeks at some of the larger RAAs. And that really depends on a lot of different things. How complete the file is when it comes in, if the person uploaded all of the requested documents with their application, how responsive the landlord is. There's a lot of moving pieces to a Raft application and an IRMA application. But again, we are working really closely with the RAAs to get these response times down as quickly as we can, especially as we near the end of the CDC moratorium. And I think I heard that we're holding questions till the end. Sorry, this is a slide from a different presentation, but yeah, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Amy. So actually, we're gonna go ahead and ask some questions right now, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
There was a question that came up. Can you be denied Raft if you have back rent owed?
Potentially, that wouldn't be kind of the reason for denial, but people can be denied for Raft if they're over income, although in that case, they might just be referred to IRMA. If their application is not complete or if their landlord refuses it. So we have seen, unfortunately, some cases where someone owes, well over $10,000 and Raft isn't going to be enough to stop the eviction. In those cases, the person could possibly be denied for, because the payment wouldn't kind of solve the eviction if the landlord's not going to forgive the rest of the rent. But the person could potentially use Raft instead to move to a different unit. So that there's options there, but yeah, owing back rent in most cases would help someone qualify.
Thank you so much. There was another question that came up on, if someone has a co-signer and they need some help with Raft, would that be an issue? What happens when a tenant needs help but has a co-signer on the lease? Do they not get help from these programs? Can they receive help?
Yeah, if they've fallen behind and they owe the rent, they could qualify. Yeah, the RAs wouldn't really look at whether or not there's a co-signer on the lease.
Okay. And let's see. It's another question here. If an individual is currently unemployed with no income, could they still be eligible for the $4,000 to $10,000, assuming that the additional amount would be enough to stabilize their housing for 6 months? Or would the individual have to themselves prove sustainability by having a certain amount of income to pay for part of their monthly ongoing rent at time of the application?
So what we need to see for that higher benefit is that, that the housing will be stabilized for 6 months. So that could be a combination of Raft payments or tenant income or a combination. So yeah, I mean, if $10,000 will pay for their back rent and their rent for 6 months, then that's fine, as long as if they do have income, as long as they're paying at least 30% of their income towards the rent.
Thank you. And one more question. Can a landlord apply for Raft for a tenant that owes back rent and get the money paid for that back rent?
Yes, actually. Thank you for that question, because I should have mentioned that. We just launched a landlord application at each of the 11 RAAs. We're calling it the landlord door. It's a separate way for landlords to apply if their tenant, for whatever reason, can't or won't. It's only open to small landlords who own 20 or fewer units, and the tenant does have to sign a consent form. So it's not It's not something the landlord can do on their own without the tenant's input. But if the tenant consents and says, it's easier for whatever reason for the landlord to fill this out for me and go through the process than me alone doing it, the landlord now has that option, and that's available on each RAA's website.
Good to know. Thank you so much. One more, and then we will move on. There was a question here about housing vouchers. If you're able to, is it just in Massachusetts, or if you have a housing voucher here in Massachusetts, can you bring it over to another state?
That really depends. There's a lot of different factors that might affect that. The short answer is that if someone has a Section 8 voucher, that's a federal voucher and can be used in any state or U.S. territory, actually. But sometimes the housing authorities or voucher administering agencies have rules about how long you have to stay in Mass. Sometimes it's a year, but that really depends on the voucher. And so someone with a voucher who has that question should really talk to their leasing officer at their housing authority to find out the specific rules of their voucher. If they have the Mass Rental Voucher Program, an MRVP voucher, that is just for Massachusetts.
Thank you so much, Amy. So I know we're going to try to have some more time for questions at the end of our presentation. So I am going to go ahead and move forward and introduce our next panelist, Colby Andrade, who is a recent Master's of Social Work graduate from Bridgewater State University. And she is also an outreach crisis counselor for MassSupport. Welcome, Colby, and thank you so much for being part of this presentation.
Hi, everyone. Tonight I'm going to be discussing the topic of remaining resilient, right? So how do we remain resilient during a global pandemic? So what is resilience? Resilience is the ability to bounce back to life, returning stronger than ever before. It's a vital component to our health and well-being. Rather than being overcome by perceived failures, missed opportunities, or issues beyond our control, people who are resilient are able to find a way to carry on and thrive. So just some key factors that contribute to resilience are the ability to self-regulate, being flexible while having healthy boundaries with yourself and others, maintaining a positive outlook, supportive communication skills, seeing failure as an opportunity to grow. And all of these qualities can help us to accept change, adapt to difficult situations, keep things in perspective, and help us overall take good care of ourselves. Being resilient doesn't mean that you never feel discomfort or experience distress or heartbreaking life events. In fact, often the road to resilience is paved with adversity, trauma, and a great deal of emotional dysregulation. It's important that we develop strategies and relationships that sustain our overall well-being and capacity to build resilience when met with challenges. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 3 R's of self-care: reflection, regulation, and relaxation. So reflection, what is reflection about? So reflection is really just noticing your reactions and patterns to situations. And this can allow us to plan for how to engage in some intentional self-regulation and self-care. Reflecting on what you and the people around you are doing and systems you're working with, your relationships with them, and what support that you might need is a vital part of reducing the impact of stress. Planning for how you can healthily cope with the impact of toxic stress. Regulation. So regulation is about the way that we choose to respond in the moment when we start to experience a stress response. Remembering that the people around you are also experiencing intense levels of stress, right? We're all in this pandemic together. Everybody is affected by this in some way or another. And we may all have strong emotional reactions, and those strong emotions are contagious. So it's important to know what our own trigger points are and what upsets us, what activates you, what sort of makes you feel like you're experiencing that stress. And really practicing catching and releasing your own defensive reactions, and then having some compassion for any self-protective tendencies. Most of all, noticing when you are reacting, stopping to take some time to calm yourself down when you get angry or hurt, asking for help, and debriefing with your supports when necessary. Relaxation is about keeping yourself strong and balanced, finding some balance in your life, making time for yourself to relax and play, whatever that means for you. Maybe you like to play a board game with your household members. Maybe you like to binge watch some Netflix, do yoga or meditation. Maintaining that social support system. So FaceTiming with friends if you can't see them, calling people on the phone, writing a letter. Maybe you do a Zoom game night or a Zoom movie night. And your sense of humor, laughing a little bit, doing things that make you feel at home with yourself. And just remember to be gentle, patient, and realistic with yourself, as we're all in this together. And if anyone has any questions.
Colby, thank you so much for that. So important for us to, you know, have those 3 R's and you know, manage and have some coping strategies throughout this really difficult time. So thank you so much for your presentation. I'd like to go ahead now and bring out our panelists. Once again, we have several questions that I'm hoping we could get to. If you're available for a few more questions, David, Yarlenis, and Amy, I have some questions coming up, and I was hoping maybe we could answer some of them before we finalize our event this evening. And let's see. So I have a question here. Are there RAA community liaisons that come out to speak to programs about these benefits? I'm assuming that might be for Amy.
Yeah, so all of the RAAs do some level of, you know, education and information in the communities, outreach. They don't, that probably looks different at every RAA, but I would say if you know, are looking for a presenter in your specific region, so yeah, maybe reach out to that RAA and see what they can offer in terms of having someone come out.
Thank you so much. Another question. Can people on disability apply for Raft?
Sorry, I lost my mute button for a second. Yes, yep, there's no, as long as they have income under 50% AMI and they're experiencing a housing crisis, there's no rules about like what type of income they have. Anyone who meets the income eligibility and has a housing crisis is welcome to apply.
Thank you. And one more, Amy, is there a limit to applying for and receiving Raft or IRMA funding?
Yep, so Raft is 4,000 or up to 10 for COVID under certain circumstances, and then IRMA is 4, and that's in a 12-month period. So, you know, someone could hypothetically get $2,000 in Raft now and come back in 6 months and get the other 2,000. It doesn't have to be kind of all at once, but once they hit that limit, they are, you know, they can't get more until the year has passed.
Thank you so much. We have another question. Is IRMA available to people who are working full-time, but their income isn't enough to afford an apartment, and they need to move out as a result of COVID?
So IRMA cannot be used to help people move, but it can be used to keep them in their current housing. So it can pay rent arrears or ongoing rental stipends, and it can pay mortgage arrears or ongoing mortgage stipends. But if they're looking to use Raft or to get funds to move, they'd have to access Raft instead of IRMA.
Thank you, Amy. I think this question might be going over to David or Yelenis. The question is, I have a client whose apartment burnt down and him and his family are now homeless. And the landlord states he's not responsible for finding him a new place. What exactly are his responsibilities to his tenants?
I'll be frank, I actually don't know the answer to that question. There may or may not be responsibilities the landlord owes to those tenants for various reasons, including whether or not the fire somehow has some connection to the landlord's responsibilities. But I think if that person is interested, they are certainly welcome to call our consumer hotline, and hopefully someone will be able to respond to their question more specifically.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. I want to let our viewers, our audience know that we do have our team for MassSupport who is behind the scenes and putting these resources out online, and we will be giving you some more information before the end of this presentation on how to get in touch with MassSupport as well, if you have any other questions that we're not going to be able to get to tonight. But before I do that, let me just be mindful of the time. Someone is asking, hi, how do I apply? Amy, I think there was a resource online on how to do that, correct? That was on one of the slides?
Yep, if you go to mass.gov/COVID housing help, there's information as well as a resource lookup tool where you can find out which RAA to go to.
Thank you so much. All right, I think right now that is it for our questions. And I would like to go ahead and also give out some resources. You know that this has been a really difficult time with COVID. And so MassSupport would like to go ahead and reach out these resources to all of you for 24/7 emotional support. We do have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline listed at 800-273-TALK, which is 8255, and the National Disaster Distress Helpline, 800-985-5990. And with MassSupport, our crisis counseling program, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Facebook at masssupport.org. And our 888 number is 888-215-4920. And the way that works, it is a free, anonymous, confidential line that any individual can call from 8 in the morning to 8 at night, Monday through Saturday. And the way it works is there is a voicemail there, and one of our team leaders will be checking on that voicemail, and someone from one of our teams will be getting back to you. You can also reach us at MassSupport@riversidecc.org. I want to thank all the panelists for being here this evening. Thank you so much for sharing all that information, those wonderful resources with our audience. It was very, very much appreciated that you took time out of your busy schedules to be here with us. And from all of us at MassSupport, we want to thank you immensely for being here. It was a pleasure meeting all of you, and I hope to see you all soon.